Having multiple security cameras that players can look through can be very useful in a lot of different scenarios. For example, in a stealth-based game, it might make sense for players to be able to see where enemies are and try and figure out their paths before walking through a door, and giving them that option to do so by looking through a security camera. Or for example, in a game like Five Nights at Freddy's, where the entire game is you sitting in front of a security monitor, that's kind of the whole thing that you have to interact with, and so it makes sense to be able to use something like that. This can be very useful in a lot of different scenarios. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you exactly how you can do that for yourself. So let's jump right into it. All right, so let me show you what this is going to look like. You can actually already see it here on the, like right here in front of me. So this is actually one of the cameras that I have. You can't actually see it. It's somewhere right over there. I think I'm pointing directly at it, like right there. And then there's actually a second one. I want to say it's probably about right there. Let me go and move a little closer because I'm not quite close enough to be able to reach the view here. I don't know what's going on with my with my controller today. I guess the sensors are being a little finicky today. But you can actually see that if I go ahead and hit on previous, for example, it'll actually switch me. And there it is. It's right there. Right on over there somewhere. And that actually switches me to the next one. I can again hit previous to switch back to the one we were just looking at. And again, I can switch over to next, and that'll also scroll through as well. So you can have more than just two. I only have two in the scene here. Like I said, one over there, one over there. And you can see too, they're showing exactly what's going on, even me. Now, I obviously don't have any visible head, so you can't see the head. My head's right there. But you can see my controllers. You can see the widgets that are shooting out of my hands. You can see the environment. You can see the view that I'm looking at. So you're looking at a view through a view through a view through a view through a view all over. All that kind of stuff. And yeah, so this is a really neat little thing to have just in order to be able to serve, just kind of survey an area or multiple areas if you want to place cameras around in a level. So let me go and jump into the tutorial and show you how this is done. First things first, let's create our camera. To do this, I'm going to create a new folder here called Blueprints. And then in here, I want to right click Blueprint class, and I want to create a new actor called Camera. In this actor, we're simply going to add a scene capture component 2D that I'm going to call camera. This is what's actually going to view our overall scene using the texture target that you see down here. Now we're not going to set the texture target here, we're going to be doing this later on. To do this, jump into the event graph, and we can go ahead and remove everything that's already here if you haven't already. And then we're going to need two custom events. The first one's going to be called set texture. We're going to grab that camera component, and then we're going to set the texture target on it. In set texture, we're going to set this texture target using a variable, so that way we can store this and just access it whenever we need to. We'll come back to this variable in a second to actually set it, but for now let's just go and leave this here. Then we also need to create another custom event. This time we're going to call it remove texture. And again, we're going to set the texture target, only this time we're going to set to absolutely nothing. Coming back up to the texture target, go ahead and click on it, and then slide on over to the texture target, and we need to set this as a new render target. In order to do this, I'm going to create a new folder. This time, I'm going to be calling it Materials. Then once we've created this render target and placed it in the materials folder, then we can go and close down the camera and navigate over to that materials folder to where the render target is. Now the reason we call this materials is we're going to right click on the render target and we're going to create a material out of this. This material is what we're going to actually see in the scene. The render target is only something that the cameras themselves are going to use. I'm also going to go ahead and save both these materials. Now go ahead and open up both these, and I'm going to go ahead and size these up so that way we can see both of them in full screen. We're going to start by doing a couple quick modifications to the render target. First off, for the render target, I'm going to increase the size X and size Y to be a 1920 by 1080 aspect ratio, so that way it looks a lot clearer to the player's eye and not all blurry when we're actually looking at them. Then head into the render target material and then click on the render target matte output, and we want to change the material domain to a user interface. Once this is done, we can go ahead and feed the texture sample back in as the final color. However, we will find that this produces an error. This is actually a very simple error to fix. Click on the texture sample, and then if we actually mouse over the error, we can see that's due to the sampler type. To fix this, we're going to set the sampler type to linear color, and that should fix the issue, and we can go and save and apply that material and move on to the next step. For the next step, we're going to go and create another new folder. This is going to be the last new folder that we create, and we're going to call this folder UI. And here we're going to create a new user interface widget blueprint, and I'm going to call this camera widget and open this up. In the canvas widget, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a canvas panel straight onto the camera widget. Then I'm going to apply an image to this canvas panel, and I'm going to size this up by all the way by hitting this little icon down the bottom right of anchors and setting all the offsets to 0. This will allow for it to take over the entire screen, so that way every part of the widget is taken up by this. Then under the brush image, we're going to want to set that render target material that we created just a second ago. Once this is done, I also want to add in a couple buttons that we can use in order to cycle through these cameras. So in order to do this, I'm going to drop in a horizontal box onto that canvas panel, and I'm going to fill that horizontal box with 2 buttons, each with their own text. I'm going to go and give these texts both appropriate names, previous camera and next camera. And then I'm also going to rename these buttons to previous button and next button. And I'm also going to go ahead and size these up so these are a little bit easier to see, and they're also a little bit more appropriately positioned. So I'm going to go ahead and set that anchor so that way it takes up the entire width of the canvas panel. And then I'm also going to bring it down near the bottom by again setting our anchor near the bottom center. On our next button, I'm also going to go ahead and hit fill. And I'm also going to make sure that that horizontal alignment is all the way to the right, so that way it's shifted to the right and makes a little bit more sense in its position. And if you would like, you don't have to do this part either. You can also go ahead and add on some padding to the right and left for each of these buttons, just in order to keep it from being pressed all the way to the side. I just think that this looks a little bit more clear. Once this is all done, go ahead and click on both these buttons and then scroll down to the bottom of the details, and we need to select on pressed events. Do not use on clicked. On clicked will not work with the widget interaction components, only on pressed and on released will. Now before we start off on the on-pressed events, I'm going to go and remove a couple of these events that we're not going to need. I'm going to leave event construct only, as we're going to be using this in order to set our camera right off at the beginning. To do this, let's start by creating 2 new variables. The first one's going to be called current camera, and this is going to be an integer. This is going to store whatever camera we're currently showing. Then I'm also going to create another variable called cameras. And in case that didn't apply anything, we're going to go ahead and change the variable type to camera. And instead of single, we're going to make sure that this is an array of cameras. That way we can sift through all these cameras. Then in the event construct, we're going to go and set the current camera by getting the camera. And we're going to check to see if this is valid, because at the very start, this may not be valid. If this is not valid, we're going to run this through a delay and then run that is valid again, so that way we can actually continue correctly. But however, if this is valid, we're going to go ahead and set the texture target on the current camera. That's it for the event construct. So next, let's go ahead and move on to the on press. We're going to start with the previous button first. For the previous button, we're going to go ahead and get the current camera. Then the first thing we want to do is we want to remove the texture target. Now, as a quick note, removing the texture target is actually incredibly important in order for all this to work correctly. If we do not remove the texture target and we cycle around to this camera later on and try to set it again, it actually won't set. It'll only set the first time and that's it. The next time we go around, if we overwrite that texture target with another camera, it's simply not going to do anything. We're still going to be seeing whatever the last camera we set is. Once we remove that texture target, go ahead and get the current camera integer -1, and we want to check to see if this is less than 0. If this is less than 0, then we've gone outside the range of this array, because an array never goes below the value 0. Now, if we have gone below the value 0, then what we're going to do is we're going to set the current camera to be equal to the length of the camera's array -1. The reason we do -1 is that length is going to be one value greater than what we can actually use in the array. However, if this is not less than 0, then we're simply going to set the current camera equal to the current camera -1. Pretty simple. The final step is we need to set the texture target on the current camera. At this point, we should have the correct camera being set, so we can simply go ahead and set texture target on the current camera using the current camera integer. Now for the next button, I'm going to go and copy all this and bring it down. Since some of this will be the same, we will need to make some changes, however, since we're now increasing the value and not decreasing. First thing we're going to do is, instead of subtracting by 1, we're going to add by 1. This is obviously because we're no longer going back in our array, we're now going up in our array. I'm also going to go ahead and remove that check to see if our integer is less than 0, because we're not going to be checking to see if it's less than 0. What we're going to be doing is we're going to grab the length of our cameras, and then we're going to check to see if our current camera plus 1 is greater than or equal to our camera length. Now, if this branch returns true, we're going to set the current camera equal to 0, since this will return us back to the beginning of the array. However, if this is false, we're going to set the current camera equal to the current camera plus 1. The set texture target will remain the same, since the only thing we really need to worry about here is whether or not our integer is increasing or decreasing and handling that correctly, so that way it still stays within the bounds of our array. Once this is done, we need to actually use this camera widget. To do this, I'm going to go ahead and jump back into that blueprints folder we made at the beginning, and this time I'm going to create another new actor, this time called camera widget. In this camera widget, I'm going to give it a widget component, and then I'm going to set the widget class equal to the camera widget UI that we made earlier on. I'm also going to increase this draw size. If you'll notice, by default, the entire thing looks black, and we're not actually seeing the buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and increase this so that way we're actually able to see the entire widget in all its glory. The final step is jumping into the event graph, and here in the event graph, we're going to need to use only the event begin play. In here, we're going to get that camera view widget, we're going to get the user widget object from it, cast to camera widget, and then we're going to set the cameras array based off of a new array that we're going to create here in the camera widget. This is because we can't really access the UI's variables by default, so we need to actually have some kind of go-between, and that's what this camera widget is for. Also, don't forget to make sure that this new variable of arrays that you set is public, so that way we can actually set this by default. Once this is all done, in order to actually use this camera widget and the camera, all we need to do is drop in the camera widget into the scene. I'm going to go ahead and rotate it so that way it faces the player a little bit more correctly, and I'm going to scale this down so that way it's a little bit more comfortable to view. I'm also going to drop in 2 cameras, and you can orient these however you want. I'm going to orient these so they face the player's spawn point, so that way you can actually see something on each of these cameras. And then finally, we jump into the camera widget, and in here you should see that cameras variable, and as well as a plus that we can use in order to add in those 2 cameras. Once you hit that plus twice, we can go and hit that drop down and add in both those cameras, because they should just pop up. Now, we're not quite done just yet. If you're using the default VR pawn, this camera widget is actually not going to work. And you may have noticed that I kept the camera widget actor open. I did actually have a reason for that, because there is something we're going to want to reference in order to get the VR pawn to work. So first, go ahead and open up that VR pawn. Then once you have it open, go ahead and head on over to the viewport, and then we want to check both of our widget interaction components. In here, you'll notice that the trace channel is currently set to 3D widget. This is actually incorrect in order for our widget to work. If we check the camera widget itself and we go down into collision, we can actually see under collision presets that the UI's object type is world dynamic. So we need to make sure that for both of our widget interaction components, that trace channel is set to world dynamic and not 3D widget. Now, as a quick side note, I did actually forget to record something here, something that I did that you actually saw in the VR preview. I also set show debug to true. Now, this is definitely good for testing if you want to be able to actually see that pointer widget, that red line that I saw. That's what allowed for me to see that by clicking that show debug. You don't have to do this if you would prefer to use something like a spline, or you have a stack mesh you would like to use instead. You can use that as well. But just keep in mind, I did also hit show debug and set that to true, just to make sure that I could actually see it while we were doing this testing. Now, in addition to this, our widgets actually are not capable of clicking on the UI at the moment because we don't have anything set to allow us to do that. This is actually pretty simple to do as well. I'm going to head into the event graph. I'm going to steal both the trigger left and trigger right since we're not using that for this tutorial. Then in here, grab whichever widget interaction you want to be bound to whichever trigger. In this case, I'm grabbing the widget interaction left for our trigger left. And then we want to press pointer key on pressed. Make sure that the key is set to left mouse button. And then on released, we're going to take that same widget interaction left, and I'm going to release pointer key. Again, the key is going to be left mouse button. The same thing applies for the trigger right, only this time you'll be using the widget interaction right instead of the widget interaction left. So you can go ahead and copy and paste those press pointer and release pointer keys, and then just drag down the widget interaction right and drop that into the target value for both. And that's it. Now you have a couple of cameras that you're able to easily swap between, and you're able to increase or decrease the amount of cameras as much as you would like. I do also want to note too, in case you notice that the camera looks like a black screen, that is to be expected. It'll remain a black screen until you actually hit play in the editor. If you don't hit play, then it's just going to remain a black screen and you're never going to actually see anything in that widget preview. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button down below. And also I'll give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters. And with that, I'll see you in the next reality.